Thank you. Thank you for being here. What a pleasure. I really appreciate the organizers of this for the opportunity to look back and look forward. As Rick mentioned, I came from the University of Oklahoma, and my area of research had to do with groundwater remediation. So groundwater contamination, pollution is a big issue in the early years, and I have to thank Mike Barcelona for helping to recruit me and host and help the center get launched and established. I want to mention that when I was interviewing, I asked Mike, how did the center come to be? Because I knew at Oklahoma it would be difficult to just get a new program, a new initiative like that established. It just doesn't happen just simply. And Mike kind of understated things and said he just wrote a memo and floated it on up and it got approved. And I'm like, no, it wasn't that easy. I can't believe it was that easy. Mike fought hard for the center to be created, and many battles internally, administratively. I think maybe the complicated oversight structure that we inherited was part of many of those battles and struggles that he and many other people led to get the center established. And, you know, looking back 30 years later, how many other institutions like that have been created? Zero. So you can see how hard it was and unique it was for the center to be created, and we owe a tremendous amount of gratitude to the people that came before us. So I'm going to focus on the research program initially, and if you look on the center's website, there's a list of the projects that have been funded over the years, and you'll notice I was assistant director and research program coordinator. We inherited about $1 million a year or more of funding to give out in grants every year. So we did solicitations and reviewed all the proposals and selected those and managed them. So every one of the projects that's funded has a story behind it. And so over 200 projects, we could be here the rest of the day just telling some of those stories. So I'm only going to be able to hit on some highlights, but these are some areas where we funded quite a bit of research. I picked Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge. Quite a number of studies were done down there. PCB contamination in the soils and in the lake and in the fish. And one of the studies we did down there was to look at, in more detail, the PCBs in the fish that were legally to harvest and consume. And Dave, being a fisheries biologist, felt like there could be some contamination in the fish, and there was no fish advisory down there. So I remember going down there, and the lake was, I think it was in a fall day, it seemed like the lake was full of birds. Of course, Dave knew every species of bird that was on the lake. Beautiful setting, and I remember the manager of the National Wildlife Refuge was not too friendly towards us because he was happy that there was no fish advisory down there. Anyway, the whole fish sampling program for the state of Illinois was reviewed as a result of that, and there was a fish advisory issued for Crab Orchard because we did find levels of PCB contamination in game fish down there that hadn't been detected before. Fortunately, the levels were going down and that fish advisory could be lifted. But it gives you an example of some of the types of impact that our research had that you wouldn't get from just reading the summary of it. Waukegan Harbor, we did a lot of work up there, the PCB contamination in that harbor. And it's recently been announced it's cleaned up. But back then, people in the Natural History Survey and the Geological Survey in particular were looking at the contaminants in the harbor. They were looking at the microbial degradation of PCBs in the harbor, and I think it was some of the earliest studies of PCBs in the environment to determine that there was dechlorination going on of the PCBs and degradation of the PCBs into other chemicals besides PCBs, that some of which were probably more toxic than the PCBs themselves. And so we were looking at the overall toxicity of the harbor.
I think the Corps of Engineers wanted to dredge out the harbor, and they weren't real happy with our studies because we found that sediments to be highly toxic. And I think they had to kind of revise and modify their dredging strategies for that harbor. We also funded some other studies to try to look at innovative technologies for cleaning up the contaminants in Waukegan Harbor. Lake Calumet, there were so many studies we funded with the surveys, and you're going to hear some presentations later today about some of that from Jeff Levengood. So I think just suffice it to say that I think we did about a 2-day workshop up in Kankakee just on all the research that was done at Lake Calumet, looking at the toxicity of the sediments, the industrial history of that site, and as Dave said, we thought you could spend all the Superfund there, and while it was a huge problem, we felt that we needed to better investigate the issues up there and help develop some strategies and look at that as a real opportunity to address those problems in that part of south side of Chicago. Looking at also movement of contamination potentially into Lake Michigan from that site. Rockford was one of the earlier areas, as I think Mike mentioned. Loves Park, I never heard of Loves Park until I came to Illinois. Sounded like a great place to live, but it actually had quite a bit of industrial contamination, groundwater contamination, Rock River going through there. And so with Craig Colton, he did the industrial history of Rockford from, I don't know, maybe the late 1800s to about 1950 or so, looking at all the kinds of industry that occurred there and the waste that was generated and what did they do with those wastes. We did a lot of work on groundwater studies in the Rockford area, because part of the issue had to do with how to adequately sample the groundwater for contamination. And we did the historical studies with Craig so that when we found contamination, it was typical to point fingers at existing industry. Say, well, there's contamination, they must have caused it. But it could have been caused by some industrial plant that had been there 40, 50 years earlier. So we tried to put together a more comprehensive picture of the issues for the Rockford area, and then looked at the Rock River itself and looked at all the contaminants in the sediments from Rockford on south, trying to understand where those contaminants came from and tie it back to the industrial history of the area. And then I'll just mention Lake Depew. When we came into DNR, one of the things that we were all trying to do is prove our value to the new department we were in. What do we have to bring to the table? And Lake Depew was an area in Illinois that the legislature required DNR to dredge out the sediment from that lake so that there could be boat races held in Lake Depew. Well, the sediment in Lake Depew was contaminated from industrial sites, and the sediment was put on DNR land. So all of a sudden now, DNR had to manage contaminated sediment land. The lake itself was contaminated, and there were still contaminants from the industrial sites seeping into the lake. Such high levels that some of the metals were plating out on the docks that were in the lake. So the surveys did studies across the lake, trying to better characterize the contamination. We did studies on the DNR land site, and a lot of work to try to look at natural resource damages in the Lake Depew area. So a multitude of research projects we funded and helped to address that problem at Lake Depew. So those are some of the sort of big projects, at least, that came to my mind as I was doing a review of our research program. If you look at my topic, like I said, if you looked at the list of all the research projects we funded, it looks kind of random. But when you really, there were areas that we focused on. We tried to understand waste issues in the state of Illinois, waste characterization, where it's produced, what's the toxicity of it, or where is it managed. One of the early things that the GeoSurvey initiated, and I think this got initiated even before Dave and I came, I think under Mike's leadership, was an inventory of all the landfills in the state of Illinois. and that still exists as the most comprehensive inventory yet, and is still used today. We looked at historical waste management practices that Dr. Colton led. Quite a bit of work was done on improved landfill design and siting. It should be an S, not literature citing, but landfill siting. Sorry about that. So many people in the room were involved in those kind of studies to improve landfill design for the state and regulations for the Pollution Control Board. We did funded studies on assessment of regional groundwater contamination that Mike Barcelona was one of the principal investigators on, and modeling of groundwater contamination from landfills, the geosurvey, civil engineering, others in the state were involved in those studies that served as the basis for new landfill design regulations. The water survey was pretty heavily involved in air quality monitoring around the state, using Bonneville as background and setting up monitoring sites in East St. Louis and in the Chicago area, trying to understand, besides what's regulated, what are the additional pollutants coming out of industrial facilities that need to be looked at and maybe regulated or prevented more carefully. I remember one of the monitoring sites was on a school building, a grade school building in the Calumet area, and we were up there with Bill Curtis interviewing us, and there was an industrial plant right next to us that started spewing out smoke, and he shoved the microphone in my face and said, "What's that?" And I'm like, "Oh, great." We got national news that said, "Looks like steam to me," and he was not too happy with my response. It didn't make the cut. He was hoping that I was really going to describe some horrible pollution that was coming out into the atmosphere. But anyway, those were some of the breadth of the types of research that was undertaken. We also did quite a bit of work on waste incineration technologies, innovative waste treatment technologies. I'll mention one of them was in Rantoul, where we funded a project to look at something called Extracts, which was a technology developed by Waste Management Incorporated to clean up contaminated soils from petroleum waste. So that just gives you an example of some of the types of innovative waste treatment technologies that were being developed during that time period. Cleanup and remediation, some more work there. Mike Barcelona led studies on how do you do groundwater sampling in order to adequately characterize groundwater contamination, so development of those kind of methodologies. Looking back, we funded several studies on waste sterilization, including at Bradley University and some here at the U of I. Quite a bit of bioremediation work. Dr. Bruce Rittman was in civil engineering here, then he moved on to Northwestern and others. Hydraulic fracturing. Larry Murdoch is a guy that you'll see as an author of one or two of the reports. This was a technology that was developed by USCPA in Cincinnati Research Lab for fracturing the surface area and more rapidly recovering contaminants from usually organic contaminants. And we funded some of the demonstrations of this technology, first demonstrations at contaminated sites in the country, and it actually became approved technology by Illinois EPA. And they found, if you look at their report, that it could increase contaminant recovery by at least an order of magnitude. In other words, maybe cutting down pump and treat programs from 100 years to 10 years in order to clean up the site. And I believe the first place that this was applied commercially was at a Xerox facility here in Illinois. So we think of hydraulic fracturing in a different context today, but it's also used to save a lot of money and a lot of time and help clean up the environment. Herbicide-contaminated soils was another interesting story. Illinois EPA came to us. Dave and I used to go to Illinois EPA every year and tell them about the research we were funding and also ask them what are some of the challenges. And they told us that at all the pesticide applicator sites in Illinois, the applicators would take their herbicide tanks at the end of their application and wash out those tanks and basically dump the herbicides on the ground. And they were all contaminated, and it was going to cost over $1 million per site to clean them up. And I don't remember how many hundreds of these sites there were, but it was going to bankrupt the whole pesticide application industry in Illinois. And so Illinois EPA said, we don't want to do that, but we got to clean up these sites. Are there any innovative ways to address this issue? And part of our solicitation was for ideas, and Alan Felsod at the Natural History Survey made a proposal to take the contaminated soil, analyze the herbicides that were in that soil, and apply it to cropland at the same rate that you would apply fresh herbicides. And then, so we funded studies here just south of Windsor on the agricultural plots down there. He took a manure spreader and the contaminated soil that we brought in and spread it on the cropland, and basically showed that using that contaminated soil could control the weeds and did not result in uptake of herbicides into corn or soybeans at levels that were above regulatory standards, safe for, I don't know if they could use it for human consumption, but at least animal feed. And that became a law in Illinois that it was okay to use that strategy to clean up these sites. And I think Illinois was the first state in the nation to do this, and it became adopted, I think, throughout the country essentially, and it saved that industry. So it's an example of how we work together to address a real vexing problem and come up with a reasonable solution. Another area I just mentioned is manufacturing gas plant sites, and the many sites around the state of Illinois and some of the innovative technologies we funded for dealing with that problem. In the pollution prevention area, there's much that I could say. I'm going to leave a lot of that for Tim Lindsay, but some of the areas we worked with the American Farmers Society, headquartered in Illinois, on their waste, as farmers being the bedrock of our economy in a lot of ways. The White Right Project was Waste Reduction Innovative Technology Evaluation Project, and we were it was an early program funded by US EPA out of Cincinnati, and some of the companies that we worked with under that, RB White, MK Label Systems, Office of Printing Services, and others. In the printing area, we were looking at innovative ink technology, getting away from petroleum-based inks to soy-based inks to water-based inks, and doing in-plant measurements of the waste and emissions that were generated from alternative inks and technologies. RB White was a metal finishing company that was one of our early successes. We did a lot of work with the metal finishing industry, worked very well with the whole sector to try to help them reduce their waste streams. I wanted to mention another thing we did is laboratory waste reduction. We went around to schools and universities to help them reduce chemical waste from their labs. And we started the green chemistry program here at the U of I. So those are some of the innovative things. And then I just wanted to mention, we started to look more at whole systems instead of, like, say, company by company, manufacturing line by manufacturing line, but we started to look at issues of where does industry get their information and how do they change their behavior, and where do they, we were from the government and we were there to help industry, so to speak, and we got frustrated at times because industry didn't always take our advice. Even when they thought it was great, they didn't always take our advice. So we funded some research in how industry gets their information and how they make changes. And Tom Bierman and Frank Waterstrat at Illinois State University led some of those really groundbreaking studies, looking at and also looking at supply chain and how manufacturers and their suppliers can work together to set up relationships that provide the right incentives to minimize waste. On the politics side, I just wanted to mention, there's a lot of word at the state level. There was a Hazardous Waste Advisory Council. I don't know if anybody's mentioned that, but that was something that was early mandated, and we were heavily involved in that, where there was representatives from labor, from environmental groups, from industry, and other sectors, and we met to issue reports to the legislature on what should be done to address these problems in Illinois. And I think it's funny, after about 2 or 3 years, we concluded that our work was done and sunset ourselves, but the state auditors kept asking us every year what we were doing, because while we sunset ourselves, the state legislature never did. So anyway, that was a real good introduction to all the different players and interest groups in the state of Illinois for us. The Pollution Prevention Act in Illinois, Kevin Green, I believe, helped craft the language for that, as well as he was, I consider, the primary author of the Toxic Pollution Prevention Act for the state of Illinois. And then that was when he was not a state employee, and then IEDA decided to hire Kevin after he wrote the law. So anyway, I want to give Kevin a lot of credit for what he did to enhance the mandate and legislative responsibilities for the center. At the federal level, as you kind of got the idea, in 85 up through 90, those were heady years, challenging years, exciting years. We spent years debating terminology like, should we be waste reduction, waste prevention, pollution prevention. We also advocating that US EPA really needed a strong pollution prevention program, and for that matter, Department of Energy and Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, and eventually the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990 was passed, and we had a pretty strong hand in crafting that legislation, lobbying for that legislation. It funded the National Information Network, which is now called the Pollution Prevention Exchange. And you can see I took the description of that act right out of Wikipedia. So it's the last major environmental act passed by Congress, and has had a significant impact on our nation and the world, and also revise the toxic release inventory. So on the politics side, there's so much more that could be said. I also wanted to mention some legislatively mandated studies. And in the early years of the center, just about every year, we got some extra funding due to efforts of folks, our government relation folks, and also Karen Witter and others. We got some extra funding to do these studies. One of them was the multi-survey in a review of the Class 1 injection wells, and I have a copy of that report here. Tremendous work that was done in the water survey and geosurvey primarily on reviewing that, and we ended up making some recommendations to the Pollution Control Board on how to improve that practice in Illinois. Another one was about paint waste, and some people wanted to ban paint waste going into landfills, mainly from households. We did a comprehensive survey of the issue in Illinois and came to the conclusion that industrial paint use dwarfed homeowner paint use, and that scenario that really needed a lot of attention. A big area in the early years was Illinois was fortunate to have a database on industrial non-hazardous waste. So hazardous waste is defined legally in the law. It's not exactly a scientific definition. It's more a definition came up with by a bunch of lawyers on Monday morning. Actually years of debate and compromise. But we continue to look at what really all the waste that's not classified legally as a hazardous waste. How toxic and dangerous is it, and how should it be managed? And that was called special waste in Illinois, and Illinois required manifesting of that waste. I don't know if very many other states did, so Illinois had the best data in the country about this unregulated, so to speak, category of industrial waste. And any industrial process waste that was not a hazardous waste was treated as special waste. So we along with Roger Neer and Michael Pleva at U of I, developed something called a degree of hazard system for regulating those wastes and determining which of those could be deregulated. And that ended up being implemented in Illinois law and was effective for several years. I'll just say briefly, I remember somebody from Mars Candy Bar called me up one day and said, we got these wrappers, just wrappers from candy bars that are a little bit off spec. I mean, I think there was something wrong in the printing of it. And the way the regulations were, it had to be essentially handled as a hazardous waste. And we ran it through the system and one day got it deregulated so it could be, those candy bar wrappers could go into a regular municipal landfill and save the company a lot of waste. Currently, these issues are still present with us today, and you saw that in the early years we did a lot of work with PCB waste, and even most recently the legislature came to us and the center and asked us to look at PCB waste in the Clinton landfill. And through that, you know, we found some areas where the regulations could be made, could be improved, as well as we found that there are still PCBs in the environment and in even the paper that we handle, and we're still exposed to PCBs in the world today. So the problems still are with us to some extent. Recently, the U.S. Newspapers made some predictions about, they asked the writers for Back to the Future for some predictions. And one of the things that they said for the future is that people will own fewer things. There is the cloud storage, etc. But the Internet of Things is going to change so much about the way we live. We're going to have not only our homes electronic, but industry is going to have a lot more information. We're going to get a lot more data than we ever knew what to do with. And, you know, we'll have the autonomous automobiles and also ability to work from anywhere, wherever. Online learning is going to be growing in the future. So I think that's something for us to think about, is how we can provide our information, our expertise more effectively. Hands-on, how-to, and practical training will increase in value. That's sort of my prediction. What I'm trying to say is the basic principles on which the center has founded its assistance and its research will still be valid in the future. The supply chains will probably be simplified. The writers of this article predicted that turning our garbage into energy will be a big deal for the future. Mike mentioned the increased waste in landfills and what to do with it. And then the authors of Back to the Future also predicted the Cubs will win the World Series in 2045. So there is hope for the Cubs. I predict that in 30 years I'll be 95, hopefully. The center will be a test bed for large-scale solutions to energy and climate issues. We'll still be dealing with climate change, droughts, food supply, floods, and the cost of entitlement and healthcare issues. So those will still be with us. I don't think we'll have solved all those problems. And on the people side, I have so many people that to thank and appreciate. It has been really a pleasure to work with all of you during these last 30 years. And George Vanderbilt often said our best asset was our people. And this is a picture of our information program from a few years ago. And to just give you a little idea of that effort, some of which are still with the center today. This is our technical assistance program. Some of them, again, still around, all men and all smiling. I guess that's good. They have good esprit de corps, but I think we have a little more diversity in that area today, at least. And then this is the center as a whole and the people that are involved. So, you know, I want to conclude by just saying thanks to Mike Barcelona and all the people that envisioned the center, and who could have imagined the last 30 years and all that we've been able to address and do. And, you know, you go to work day by day, and it's kind of a struggle, and yet when looking back, I think we've had a real impact. The Governor's Awards program, the research program, technical assistance program, the information program, we've had an impact nationally as well as for the state of Illinois. So I think we can be proud of what we've done. and have great hope and encouragement for the future. Thank you.